And I think we're live. Okay, Nicola, over to you.
Great. Thank you for joining, everyone. You all probably know how to use Zoom, but in case you want this tip, there is a split view, so you can watch my screen and also see all of our lovely faces. And we'll do introductions in a moment and kind of walk through the roadmap. But also, you know, we like to acknowledge that we are all humans. So thank you for letting us into your house. No need to apologize if you have, you know, background noises or anything. We recognize that lots of things are happening around us, which is totally fine. So, you know, we're going to have a breakout group and do various things. But if you need to, you know, momentarily stop your video, grab a glass of water, any of those things, do that. We are humans, and work shouldn't suck, but also workshops shouldn't suck. So I'm going to share my screen. We're in Mural right now. In a little while, we're all going to be in here, but for now, I will be sharing my screen. So what are we doing today? So we talk about this in terms of work shouldn't suck organizations, but so many of you probably have a lot of different teams and organizations that you're working with. And sometimes, you know, the thought is, well, how does this relate? I don't necessarily work in a, you know, traditional organization with a traditional team, but we like to say that, you know, if you work with humans to achieve a goal, there's something here for you. You know, we use the idea of a team very broadly. And so as you think through all of these things today, you can choose, you know, a lot of different teams, a lot of different ways that you're interacting with humans. So we're going to do some introduction into the stories that we tell about workplace culture. I mean, workplace culture is so complex. We all tell stories about workplace culture. Then we're going to do some group creative case studies, which is really when we get into the game. And usually it is a physical card deck, but we are not doing that right now. So we've created a virtual version of this, and we're going to do some creative case studies using that card deck. And then there'll be a little share back. And then we're going to kind of talk about individually within each of our own teams, what does this mean for us? So now we get to all introduce ourselves.
Nicola, you want me to go first?
Yes.
Great, as you're pulling up.
Get
Great.
the link.
Cool. Hey, everyone. My name is Tim Cynova. I get the pleasure of being a co-worker with Nicola. We usually find ourselves in our day job, which is for a national nonprofit in the US called Fractured Atlas. We work with about 1 million artists, creatives, and makers around the US and stretching into Canada, helping them with the things they need to succeed as small businesses and entrepreneurs. Nicola and I'm one of the 4 co-CEOs in a 4-person shared non-hierarchical leadership team. So if you're interested in shared non-hierarchical leadership teams, I'm happy to talk for like a week about that. Nicola and I also serve on our people team, as she's our associate director of people operations. And through our work over the past couple of years, we've created Work Shouldn't Suck as sort of a consulting arm of the people operations work that we do at Fractured Atlas. Back in 2013, our organization committed to being an anti-racist and anti-oppressive organization, started that journey in earnest. And a lot of the work that we do around Work Shouldn't Suck is the how organizations who are on this journey, how professionals who are on this journey can bring that work into the workplace, into their lives. And so we spend a lot of time talking about organizational culture and policies and hiring and other components of the workplace. And so that's sort of what led us to create this game. And fortunately, I work with Nicola, who's very talented in a lot of different ways, as well as being a graphic artist and designer, and figured out how to do that. So that is our brief introduction. And did I buy you enough time, Nicola, to do what you needed to do behind the scenes?
Yeah.
Great.
So I have put the link into the chat box. If you're welcome to go into Mural, and we can all, I'm not going to share my screen right now, but if you are unable to access Mural, you can put that into chat and I can add your introduction for you. So in Mural, you'll see if you open the outline, which looks like a little checklist, there is a section called intros, or you can scroll down, or you can follow me and you will get there, and there's some gray little boxes, or you can create your own, you know, if you hate gray or something, I don't really care what color you make it, but put your name and one way that work can suck, because there probably are a lot. Lousy bosses. People don't like each other. Oh, yeah. So many possibilities. So thank you for doing that. We don't have necessarily time for us all to audio introduce ourselves with each other, but there will be some group time later that you can introduce yourselves in a smaller group setting. But thank you for adding these in there. So all of these are kind of stories that we tell about culture. And so we're gonna, people make sticky notes too big. This is hilarious. So we are now going to kind of transition into kind of what are these stories that we tell about culture, and Tim is going to take it from here for a bit.
Yeah. So when Nicola and I started working on this, I should say when Nicola really took the bulk of the work on this, we typically do this in person, where we lay out cards and do a bit more of a presentation. And so we really were thinking about, like, in this time and what's going on, what's important for us to talk about up front before we start playing the game. And I'm in the app right now, if anyone's wondering. It's a fun name to say once, but once you have a conversation with people about how you use you realize that when you purse your lips together, that doesn't just flow easily. So hopefully it gets acquired by someone like Zoom or something, so it's a little bit easier to see or to say. That aside, my critique of the name. When we typically present, we start with a quote. This, for those of you who might be familiar with, Adrienne Maree Brown wrote the incredible Emergent Strategies. This quote, in the brackets, it used to be, or it originally was, art. Art is not neutral. But as I was reading the quote and meditating on it, I thought, this actually is a really great quote for the workplace. The workplace is not neutral. It either upholds or disrupts the status quo, advancing or regressing justice. We are living now inside the imagination of people who thought economic disparity and environmental destruction were acceptable costs to their power, for their power. It is our right and responsibility to write ourselves into the future. All organizing is science fiction. If you're shaping the future, you're a futurist. And visionary fiction is a way to practice the future in our minds, alone and together. And I really love that quote in thinking about how we design workplaces. And, we're joking about work shouldn't suck, but, like, how do we design places where we want to work and that fit everyone and where everyone can thrive? And this leads us to this question about how might we proactively rethink about the future of work? For a lot of people, we just came into the jobs and organizations we have. Maybe we built our organizations. Maybe we just acquired them. And a lot of it's reactive and not, I would say, until recently, for a lot of organizations, a lot of people, with the introduction of COVID, most people didn't give a lot of thought to how you interacted, what the conference room was used for, or what that meeting's purpose was, how you live and work best. And I think this is for those who worked in offices, who have the privilege of being able to have a flexible work schedule and work environment. They're really starting to wrestle with questions like, what if I don't have to live where I work? What if I can live any place in the world or the country and still work at the job that I love? What do I value then? And so this question of, like, reframing how we think about work has really been with us as Nicola and I and our team have been thinking about this. And several years ago, we started to piece together sort of our own theory about work. And it's based off of, we studied a lot of the quote unquote great places to work, the places with seals of approval that you're a great place to work. And we realized, wow, when you look at a great place to work, some of great places to work are still racist and oppressive. So how great of a workplace is that? And then All right, so maybe some organizations are on that journey to understanding systemic racism and oppression and how to build places where more people can thrive. But self-care and resilience isn't part of it. So you burn through people. So we came up with this Venn diagram, if you will, around environments where people can thrive. And our theory is that they're people-centered organizations, people-centered organizational design combined with anti-racism and anti-oppressive organizations and commitments, and where resilience and self-care are core to that. And unfortunately, that's not. Well, sometimes I would say that I was going to say that's not easy, but I guess it isn't. But usually the question is, well, how do you do that thing? And what we found is it's a lot of asking, like, what if and how might we? And a lot of the questions people have been asking themselves recently, like, what if we didn't have access to our check stock? How would we transfer money from person to person when you can't be there virtually or in 3D? Or how do we gather around a water cooler when we don't have a water cooler? Or how do we support people who have varying schedules and commitments to care for their loved ones or homeschooling? And all these other things led us to come up with solutions and for these really challenging questions about how do we create a place. And so we often come back to what if or how might we change that thing that could be problematic. And right now, just as an example, I'll show you some of the things we're working on or we've done. Right now, we're at Fractionalize, we're currently working through the paid holidays that the organization takes. We use 12 standard holidays. I assume if you work for a standard, for a regular organization, you have, the same types of holidays that you get paid leave for if that's part of the benefits package. And we said, those were someone else's holidays that someone else decided those. So what holidays fit us as an organization, and how might we think about paid holidays in a way that better fit our commitment to anti-racism, anti-oppression now than someone who created the organization 20 years ago. So that's one of the small examples that we're working on. This is a graphic. I'm not going to read it through. If you are interested, our site workshouldsn'tsuck.co has all of these graphics and resources. And so if you're really interested in this, I wrote a piece about these are some of the things that we've done over the past 5 years to reinvent our organization into one that is more centered around the people that work there and our commitments to being an anti-racist, anti-oppressive workplace. So things like, the bottom right-hand corner says transition to fully virtual organization December 2019. So, before it was cool and everyone else did it. We also have, as I mentioned, I'm part of a 4-person shared non-hierarchical leadership team in lieu of a single CEO. We did that when we were reinvented when our CEO and founder left. And just some other things, like we have a strict fixed tier comp structure. So everyone at a given tier makes exactly the same, so we can be transparent about how much people make and when you're applying for the job, and also internally. I often talk with groups, and it's like, all right, well, there's a lot of different things that you can do, but why don't we do that? And it's this fun little thing that called the scarcity cycle. I teach I'm on faculty at the New School in New York City, and I teach a course in people-centric organizational design. And I usually use the example of students who have to get their homework assignments done for my class versus students who have to get their homework assignments done for the director of the program. And it's this thing of like, everyone thinks they can get stuff done at the beginning of the semester, but as semester goes on, you start to delay things. And so you're like, oh, I've got to get stuff done for that other class, not Tim. So I'm going to borrow from Tim's class to get the other thing. And then you focus on tunneling, and then you neglect Tim's class, but you've got to pay interest, and that interest might be, maybe I'll just stay up 23 hours a day and then sleep 1 hour a night, stay up 23 hours. And I tried that in college. I lasted like 3 hours into it. But it's like all these things that I'm juggling: sleep schedule and home schedule and work and delayed commitments and short-term solutions. And we're constantly revisiting, revising until we get right back to the top with fewer resources. And we're further behind. And so it's, I don't know if you've encountered this, but I've never met an organization who said, no, we have enough resources, we have enough money, we have enough people, we have everything that we possibly can use right now. We don't need anything else. So there's always this scarcity cycle that we're dealing with, which usually leads us to park let's create an organization where people actually can thrive, to a rainy day that usually never comes. To like reinvent the policies around more inclusive policies or more inclusive work structures. So it's that, building through slack, through elimination, asking ourselves, what if the resources we have right now are all the resources we need? What would we do with that? Rather than hoping for that, we work in nonprofit space as well. So hoping for that one grant from that really big funder to help you out. But being content with the resources we have right now are the resources we have to work with, and that we're all we need. With that, I don't know about you, but I'm going to shake my head. So has a really funny algorithm for the virtual background. So I really just need to change that. So I need to get back to like a regular background. So I'm seeing my head.
Before doing that, can you go back to the Venn diagram? We got a request to view it again.
Yeah, sure.
And in case anyone wants to see it larger, you can click on speaker mode, which should have it fill your screen.
So yeah, the Venn diagram: people-centered organizational design, anti-racist, anti-oppressive, resilience and self-care, and what overlapping is environments where people can thrive.
And also, we are going to share a website in a bit, and this Venn diagram is also here, but it's workshouldn'tsuck.co if you want to see it later. You don't want to like quick write it down, because sometimes I'm like taking notes, and sometimes it's helpful to know what information you'll get later.
Great. Over to you, Nicola.
Cool. So now I'm going to share my screen, and we are going to look at Mural again. And I know a few of you joined, so I will share the link to the mural again in a bit when we start in the groups. But before we get into groups, we're going to talk a little about these cards. So, we think about culture, and it's very complicated. We've talked about Tim talked about all the the philosophy that got us to this point. But we thought that it would be helpful. And if you're in Mural, you're welcome to follow me, or you can look at this screen that I'm sharing, either way. So we came up with these 8 different culture components as a way to simplify different aspects of culture. And I also want to note that you'll notice that not any one of these is anti-racism, anti-oppression, because that is a lens that is over every single one of these. And you won't necessarily see anything that says, well, okay, there's resilience, but there's not the resiliency and self-care. So a lot of these work hand in hand, and anti-racism needs to be embedded throughout the organization. So when you're going through this, think about that. We don't necessarily have one card that is for that, but it's layered over the top of everything. But we came across these 8 different culture components, not to say that these are completely the only things that make up culture, but as a framework to think about the different aspects within culture. And you, in a moment, will have time in a group to talk through these, but I wanted to talk about what these cards are. So each one of these has a component, and there's level 1 up to a 5, and we've written out a description for what level 1 is and what level 5 is. So you have a little bit of creativity to figure out what level 2, 3, and 4 is. And let's see. So these are the main culture component cards. I'm going to flip over to I'm just going to show you what one of your groups will look like. So in a moment, Brian will add you to breakout groups. There will be 4 different groups associated with 4 of these different panels. You'll see group 1, group 2, group 3, group 4. And you can take any notes that you want to, but I just wanted to talk about what you're going to do. So you are given a fake organization. You can come up with a name for it. You can get super detailed. That's totally up to you. But you will be placed into an organization, or you'll be giving an organization. You'll have to examine what happened between 5 years ago and today. So the green one is what was the organization 5 years ago? The blue is what does that organization look like today? So for this organization, we'll just look at it. Purpose alignment was it at a 2 5 years ago, and today it's at a 1. So in your group, with as much detail as you want to, you can like really get into the weeds if you really enjoy that, where you're like, this is a company that invents whatever, and they do this, that, and the other thing. But really what we want you to do is to talk about what happened in that time period. Why did these different culture components change? What are some things that might have happened in that time period to create those change? And I will also I'll add these questions into the chat. But some things that you might ask yourself to get to this kind of story that you're going to create is, are there any shifts that seem contradictory? Because sometimes, you might see that one culture component went up and one went down, and you might think, well, it seems like those should travel in alignment with each other, but they don't. Why might that be? Are there any experiences from your own teams that you've worked on that can help inform what happened in this organization? So in a moment, you will be in your breakout groups. You all have 15 minutes. Feel free to introduce yourselves to each other. That should be enough time to kind of have brief introductions and then get into these things. You're welcome to take notes within Mural. You don't have to if you really don't want to do that, but we will have some share back at the end, and you don't have to present any formally or anything, but kind of you will share back what your kind of big aha moments are, but it's not like a formal presentation or anything, so don't be worried about that. Welcome back, everyone. So do people feel like they need a few more minutes? We can go back if people really want them, but also if you don't necessarily have to have a really good story. So I think that it seems like I saw some head shakes. So, okay, we'll move on to the conversation. So I will share my screen and we can go through what happened in the groups. And also don't feel like you have to, have solved what happened in this organization. They're fictional organizations. There are no wrong answers really. So don't feel like you have to have the whole plan on what happened. So group.
Yeah, bonus points for the people who named their company.
Yeah,
and
I love when people name their companies. So group 1, is there anything you want to share about kind of how you approach this, if there were any culture components that changed dramatically, any contradictions you found, kind of anything that was interesting or surprising? Feel free to unmute yourself, and if you prefer speaking in the chat, that is also okay.
We're navigating our own shared 4-person leadership group right now.
Nice.
No one's trying to eat up space. One thing that we thought was interesting was that conversations were down and transparency was up. So curious about that disconnect. Are people getting information from a different source? Are there structures in place that share information? That was a curiosity we brought up. There are a lot of other good ones.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting to see the kind of where those disconnects might be and trying to figure out how that might have happened.
We did this in our own organization, and it was really an eye-opening for some people to see, oh, that's why that thing went that way and that went the other way. But never having sort of had these sort of 8 components to think about it, it's sort of like, well, organizational culture is good or bad or is whatever. So it was interesting to see this sort of done in real life as people were wrestling with, oh, right, that's totally what happened, and that's why those things maybe unintentionally or counterintuitively went in different directions. So yeah, great to start with one of those.
Or maybe people are being passive aggressively transparent. You know, I mean, there's so many possibilities there, right? Like people could be transparent about everything, including like how much they hate everyone. And then, you know, maybe that makes conversations really terrible. You know, who knows what might have happened. So is there anyone else from group 1 that wants to share anything? Okay, we're gonna actually jump to group 4 because you actually have the same organization, maybe the same card deck. So if there's anyone from group 4 that has anything that's kind of similar to group 1 or different.
Who wants to voice over? Mary Jo, Rachel, Rebecca?
Mateo does.
Yeah, so we were scheming. Some of us were thinking, who might this be? Is it Mural? Is it Mural themselves? Is it our company? We don't know. So growth, like maybe there is a ton of growth that just happened that's kind of stretching the fibers of this organization in a lot of weird ways. Fast growth can really ding the culture. You can really just trash it because that special sauce just gets thinned out too much. So now we're not doing all those amazing things that made this place such an amazing place before. I think I'm rising to the meta level of the voiceover for this. Compadres, would you like to add anything else?
I think the one thing I thought was interesting was that transparency of information went up, but conversation, which I read as emotional safety, went down. And I thought that was just an interesting pairing, and like how that's connected. And also that, like, you know, workplace like went up to the top, but then some of the other ones were lower. And like, so maybe that's where there was an initiative or an investment in something there or a change. But, you know, things like resilience went down and employee support went down, which is interesting because workplace went up. So it's kind of just things like that were interesting to notice.
Yeah, I just noticed that Amanda added in the chat that there might have been a thought that there might have been a buyout. Yeah, it's interesting to see kind of similarities that might happen. And yes, definitely leadership change or any of these changes of how things are done can dramatically change things. And I also, you know, transparency is great and all, but sometimes it can be done terribly. Like, I don't know if anyone read about what happened at the Away and kind of the negative side of using Slack and transparency. And so, yeah, no, it's definitely interesting to kind of see how, you know, how might these things that we think of as really good things be used in ways that are not amazing. It's definitely, you know, because there are, if you don't have a balance of these things, sometimes things can be weighed. So let's go on to group 2 now. Totally different organization. What did this group think about? Oh, so interested in hearing the summary of what happened in Away.
I posted the article.
Oh, great. Yeah,
so
read the article.
It's a long article that also
very
includes screen grabs of the Slack channel. So it's yeah, I think it's the opposite.
People weren't allowed to take vacations.
Yeah,
as like a growth opportunity. People weren't allowed to have one-on-one conversations in the guise of transparency.
That's a scary environment.
Absolutely. So yeah, anyone from group 2 have any interesting things to note about your organization?
Well, this is Jen. We talked a little bit about how recruiting went up, and that may have also explained why I can't read the screen. Conversations went up. And and transparency went up a little, that maybe with newer people in a widely expanding organization, because we thought that there was probably a growth issue here too, that people were better able to have conversations, maybe in part having to do with, as the group was growing, there was less territorial or more of a influx of people who were group oriented. But we also know that employee support went down, which we thought might have been a function of increasing like the number of worker bees and not increasing support functions like HR, who couldn't keep up with the influx.
Great. I'm also seeing some similarities from other ones. Change fatigue, change is hard. There's some themes about change for sure. Also, a lot can change within 5 years. Just seeing if there's anything else on here. Yeah, anyone else from group 2 have any kind of things you thought were particularly interesting?
Sure. Yeah, so just a quick thought. Sorry, didn't know I was off mute. So it's just interesting when you start to look at transparency improving, conversations improving, employee support went down, and that just seems kind of confounding when people talk about bringing their whole selves to work, but maybe they're having better conversations. I want to know more. You know, I want to find out what's the story behind that.
Right.
What, do you have any ideas?
At almost 6 o'clock, I have no ideas.
That's right. My ideas ran out at like
what color
4.
wine am I having? But
right,
no,
yeah.
Who said that?
That's right.
Well, I mean, it may be that there is more on the surface kind of talk, that there's more collegiality that's more at a superficial level. So people are feeling that, but they're still not sharing their true selves. You know, there may be some hesitancy around that. I mean, I'm not sure, but once again, I'm spitballing here.
Right, yeah. I think that could totally be a possibility. Oh yeah, fake nice. So I'm currently in Minnesota, and I like to talk about Minnesota nice as like the, actually Minnesota ice as like the passive aggressiveness. It's a fascination of mine. Oh, Nebraska nice, yeah. See, I feel like there's so many places that have such a thing, which is not good conversations. I'm like, I don't think that counts as a 5 on conversations. So let's see, is there anyone in a group 3? I see you have a lot of notes. What did group 3 think happened in their organization? I love the little cookie icon.
Lee, if you're speaking, we can't hear you.
This is Lee. Hear me now? Linda and Laura and myself and Brian joined us. So we had workplace was the only one that really went down. All the others went up. So that was interesting. I think having those 8 things was very helpful. We decided the group we decided the company was founded about 1950, how the cookie crumbles, and really helped when we had a lot of the things in culture when the 103-year-old founder came to speak and clued us in on some of the recipes and why it started, and really get to the why of this. That helped a couple of the areas. Because it's a 70-year-old company and some of it hasn't been kept up well, the workplace, the equipment and stuff, we felt was struggling, and that was one of the things holding us back. So having this set of 7 things sort of helped us focus in on, okay, in our culture, what are we proud of? What's working well, what's not working well. We like the fact that the cookies can go home to the kids, which gave us work balance between family and work, and that drew in conversations with people. So there was a lot of good stuff that the cards drew out.
Great.
One of the things that we see when we'll talk in the next step, sort of how you can use this as a person, is that when people complete this, they're completing it from their own perception of what's happening. And so to Jill, that earlier point, like maybe there's one thing that happened that someone is holding on to that's causing them to anchor that as like a one, where everyone else in the organization is like, oh yeah, of course those would map together. But it's sort of that anchoring and sort of even misperception being perception. Maybe that isn't the way that thing is, but people are bringing that with them, and that's part of their experience of work. And that's one of the really fun and helpful things about the tools, that you can use this to sort of dive into specific things again, rather than tell me what you think of working here, which is useful, I think, in the broad strokes, but to get into like, well, why do you think that is that way? And then you can start to unpack, oh, that's why, because maybe you didn't get the free cookies that day that everyone else got free cookies. So you're like, this place totally doesn't take care of employees.
Right. I love that story. So thank you everyone for playing this with us. We're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to think about this each from our own organizations. So you got to kind of engage with these creative case studies, as we call them, the kind of storytelling. And hopefully you got some ideas from kind of hearing about the other organizations also, because there's so many things that can happen within 5 years. And now we're going to think kind of a little bit more about our own teams, and we're going to start thinking about our organization today. Eventually we'll kind of be forward thinking in our organization in 5 years and think about the forward. But first we're going to really look at our organization today. So if you are in Merrill, you can go to the Your Team section, and each of these it's a linked PDF. You can pull it into, I don't know, your own Merrill if you want to. You can pull it into a Google slide and type on it. You can do, you can use it however you want to. If you prefer, if you have like a printer right next to you, you can quick print it off and write it that way. Or, you might just enjoy looking at it and then on a separate piece of paper, take notes, or, take notes any way that you want to. But you can have both of these PDFs, and we are going to take 3 minutes.
Probably gonna get close to it. So,
and it's fine if you're not done. We're not going to share these back or anything. And you'll have this tool that you can continue to use to think about your own organization. So I don't necessarily be concerned that you're, out of time or anything. You can always come back to it, revisit it later. Or yeah, sometimes just going with your gut and your first choice is the way to go. Okay. So yeah, so you just talked about your own organization, your own team, your own, however you wanted to define that. So now we're going to start thinking about our organization in 5 years. So this is where kind of we talked about the 5-year period within Fractured Atlas and how much change happened in the last 5 years. And in the creative case studies, you really explored kind of what might have happened in those 5 years. And hopefully in any of those, it helped you thinking about all the different possibilities for change. So now you're going to, this is another PDF image, and you can take notes how you would have in other ways, in whatever your preference is. And so you'll now start thinking about kind of what you want your organization to look like in 5 years. Remembering that scarcity is real. I doubt that any organization will be able to be 5s across the board 5 years from now. Might be hopeful thinking, but also kind of the higher you get to 5, the more you realize how much work it takes to get from 4 to 5. So, there's this question here of what constraints exist. So what are those constraints that, might not let you get across the board, and how might you get there? And if this is kind of hard or complicated, you might think, what is the 1 or 2 culture components that would make the most difference if you were to change those in the next 5 years? So there's also some guiding questions within this. There's also kind of what is the culture component you want to focus on first, and what are the 3 things you can do in the next week to move towards that 5-year vision. We really enjoy WHOOP. I don't know if anyone has heard of it. It's a really funny name, but it's the wish. Oh, now, the one time I come up with it, I actually forget what the 4 are. Outcome, obstacle, plan. So if you want kind of further things after this, we can talk a little bit about that. But I would say first kind of look at and if you didn't finish what your organization is today, you can do that. We will give you 9 minutes to do this. And then think about kind of what do you want your organization to look like in 4 years? What constraints are there? How might you get there? Kind of start thinking about all of those different things. Are there any questions before I mute myself? Also, if you feel weird about having your video on in self-work, you can turn off your video, you can turn off your audio. That is totally fine. If you're just done with the day and you want to not do this right now, that's also fine. If you're like, oh, I'm hungry, go get a snack. You can always think about your organization later. That's also fine. Yeah, how did that go I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Looking at this exercise, I came up with a way to use it with some groups that I'm working with that it's not really team related and culture related, but they're having some other kinds of challenges, but I think I can adapt this exercise to work with them. But I have to admit, I did not do this exercise.
That's right. Like half the group was doing chat about accordion, so it's totally fine. Right. Well, and Linda, I like that in that oftentimes these can sometimes be leading indicators of other stuff that's beneath the surface. If you say that's something, and as you use that, you start to unpack, you're like, oh, that's what you mean when you talk about that, which is not at all this. And so using that to drill in. Yeah.
Yeah, I think doing these kinds of culture exercises can lead to things that you may not be getting to exactly in the cards, but in discussing what some of the cards mean can bring up other related issues where the cards might not resonate. In some cases, some of the cards will and some of the cards won't resonate with a group, but what it can do is it can raise ideas or raise issues that they use completely different language for, that promote discussion in a way that really does resonate, and you can get to some really, really deep issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, you brought up the great point that doing this with this group is a little bit meta, because I know that, a lot of you work with a lot of organizations, and it might be hard to find something for yourself to do this. So that would, if you're also, that's also totally valid to have this conversation of, what are ways that you could view using this for, any of the organizations that you work with?
I was going to offer that I think this conversation was started in the chat pre-accordion conversation, but how you make this a group exercise, and if you have people who have very disparate opinions, and having the safety to talk about why that might be, and if you don't have that safety, sort of how you that's where the meat of the conversation is, and how do you have that conversation with a group that is where people feel very, very differently about the same thing.
But I guess, yeah, that conversation was a great pre-accordion. I guess it brings up a couple of things. First, the psychological safety that we brought up with the group. If you don't have psychological safety, no one's going to answer this. Everyone's going to put, oh yeah, it's 5s. Yeah, no, I can't. Yeah, it's great. And so what's a precursor if you don't have the psychological safety to know? And maybe it's truly anonymized rankings. Yeah. Maybe it's the size of the team. If this team is 50 people, it's easier to do anonymized. If it's 3 people, you're like, all right, we're going to start guessing who put 1s down. and maybe it's not the right tool. Maybe it's the questions that it sort of came up with when you think about being supported as an employee, or when you think about professional development, or when you think about hiring, what comes to mind? And then have that as a conversation. And I think to Linda's earlier point, themes start to emerge that wouldn't have otherwise been picked up. Because I don't think it's probably the right tool for every team, and there's, especially if there's not trust and psychological safety in that team. That's great data though, right? That's like, it's telling you a lot about, so maybe what you need to work on first before you turn to this conversation, and what exercises. And of course, going to the work of Amy C. Edmondson and her terrific research around psychological safety is maybe the place to start.
Yeah, and the other thing that I added in the chat that I think is, helpful to consider is that you can also just do the creative case study and not necessarily the rank your own organization. So we did that at Fracture Atlas for our full staff gathering, because we didn't necessarily think it made sense for every single person in the organization to be like, where's the organization on all of these things? Whether it be because, people would be in groups cross levels, cross teams, might not necessarily feel comfortable talking about those things, and might not necessarily have the context. But having the creative case study and say, well, this is a fictional organization, help people think, and Tim talked about this earlier, help people think, oh, this is how change can happen. These gives us words to talk about it. And it's another way of starting those conversations. So yeah, it can be used in a lot of different ways. And also, I noticed that Brian in the chat said that you can have, only spaces. And we, in the actual card deck with there's 2 different slots. And if you only use the green side, it does have that constraint. So I would recommend, if you're doing this in a virtual setting, to either constrain or open those up a little bit more, where you say, maybe it is that you only give yourself 40 spaces, or only 30 or 20, or, you can try to play around with those and see how that changes conversations. And you can even do that with the same group as well, where you say, if we have this many spaces, where would we want to see our organization 5 years? Okay, let's cut that down. So there's, all sorts of other ways that you can kind of further constrain yourself and figure out the priorities as well.
We did that with our organization, and it was one of those moments where you're like, I nearly had tears in my eyes, because we did it with 25. So there's 40 possible, there are 25, and someone said, doing this exercise, I finally got it. Like, we can't do everything equally all the time. I'm like, oh God, that's so, yeah, right. There's resource constraints. You can't just do everything all the way to 5. So I really, that tip came from one of our coworkers who's really big into games, and sort of posited that idea. But that will always be like my heart worn, tears were welling in my eyes, and Nicola and I still had to keep going. You're like, that's a really great point. Thank you. So
you get it.
That's right. You finally get resource constraints. What other things resonated? Maybe ahas, or like, I just don't get how this works in various ways, or this part wasn't useful. We're sort of at the point where at 6:30, we're going to sort of pivot into Q&A feedback about the tool, and have already started talking about, like, especially in the chat too, other ways this might pair up with surveys on culture or engagement. Just curious to get thoughts about the experience in the tool, and what works, what doesn't.
I can go. So this is Elena. I really enjoyed the card deck, and the visuals were very helpful. I dialed in on the what constraints exist and how might you get there, and then what's next. So the 2 that I picked was the resilience and recruitment, which is something that we're dealing with. But when it got to like what's next, and having you draw out that picture, that metaphor, I think that was helpful for me to see it that way in a visual form. So I ended up putting a picture of a ohia lehua, which is one of the first blossoms that you see on a new field of lava that happens here on Hawaii Island. So it's one of the only plants that grow in very challenging conditions. So for me, I was thinking more about how we use a card deck and use those indigenous metaphors that we know within our Hawaiian culture to explain how that is within our council and the things that we're dealing with. So just wanted to thank you folks for sparking that inspiration.
That's a really amazing analogy. Thank you for sharing that. That's really great.
And I also love how much that ties back to your own organization, because that's our hope too, is that all of these can be used to embed itself within the organizations that you work with, and use the terminology that works, and use the, all the other tools that works. Like at Fractalis, we use OKRs. So we might do this and then see, okay, how do these priorities fit into our objective and key results process? But I love anything and everything that can be, tied into these and make it more useful for all of your different organizations.
Jill had a comment about, so how do personal values tie into what you answer? I mentioned how I use the competing values framework in some other instances, and in a similar way, it's like what's the current, what's the future, or what's the past, what's the current, and often include about, like, if you start to see your organization's going a different place where you might not want to go, sometimes that's the time to be like, all right, maybe I've had a great ride here, but it's branching off, and my values and what I value are not what the organization wants to be, and if that's really where it's going. And so I think it's it's both sort of a personal and a team and organizational opportunity to take a look at that.
And another cool thing I think that Jill posted earlier is that people answer differently based on their regency, their agency, their hierarchy. And I've noticed in staff surveys at my organization that you can almost tell, even if they're anonymized, you can almost tell like the voice of the person. Are they like young and peppy and just out of college and like rose-colored glasses and like they're just happy to have their first job? Are they like an old timer, been at the organization a long time and they know all the baggage from like 10 years ago? Are they somewhere in the middle? Are they frustrated because they're not growing? You can kind of tell the personas of who's speaking. And I like this card game and playing it and or using it in a group setting where we can have those discussions out in the open instead of survey responses sort of being reserved for just management to see. We're kind of communicating across lines of new team members, old team members, and different perspectives. And then you learn something about like, oh, my vision of the organization isn't the same as everyone else's. My perspective or vantage point isn't the same. So I see a lot of value in that. I'm excited to try it. I'm not in like a position of power at my organization, but like, I have enough sway that I might be able to get us to play this game.
One of the things that really sort of scares me as both sort of a co-CEO and sort of with my HR hat on is like group conversations about organizational culture. Because like maybe most people didn't feel that way and then someone brings up that thing and you're like, well, yeah, that's right. I do feel about that. Like that is a problem at this organization. And with sort of the fictional case studies, you can start to exercise that in a different way. And I think it removes people from sort of this current organization in a way that gets you exercising that before you dig into, all right, now let's look at our organization. Because that's, I'm just sharing my fears with all of you now. So that's what we've gone from accordion to Tim just sharing his fears with you. So we've reached that part of the night. Other thoughts on the tool? I see more people are posting. Yeah, we've got the, yeah, there's new instruments too, or other instruments that might be paired with this. Brian, thanks for posting those.
I wanted to add something. So it's interesting because once I went through the cards, so this team is an excellent, well put together team, tons of franchise players, if you will, but the sense of no one's really talking the same language when they're together. Some of that became a big problem, but then I kept hearing the word inclusion. And so as I started walking through the tool, I realized they are very high in some of the obvious areas, but purpose alignment, performance management, not because they're not performing, but management is too busy. They're not transparent. They don't have time. That gets in the way. And so there's a piece of inclusion that means I need to feel valued and heard and understood. Also, I need to be heard in a way that there's diversity of thought. And so it made me think a little bit about SCARF, but it also walking through this tool, it's a different conversation. It's not just this one dimension that I started out with. It's a number of things that you can use to explore that. So I really like this. I'm going to use it this week. Thank you.
Very nice.
I
Thanks.
love that you brought up SCARF.
I know.
Normally it's in our slide deck, but we had to cut it down a lot to have time for the gameplay. But you know, it always comes up in conversation. It's great.
The thoughts, reflections, burning. I don't know.
So I have a quick reflection, as long as we're coming off of mute briefly. I started thinking about this in relation to a community that I belong to, the Sangha that I belong to. And some of these things it's possible to talk about, and some of them as a member, as opposed to being on the board of directors or being, you know, the monks or any one of those things would be, I'm not going to know some of those things. Some of those things can happen. So I'm starting to look at, well, what could happen? What are some conversations that would be difficult to have that might be outside of what is accepted? And so those kind of constraints are very real also.
Since we were talking about SCARF and change, I posted a piece that we wrote several years back about human psychology in the office renovation. Nicola and I, in addition to being on the people team, people ops, were also on the ops team. And so it's an interesting intersection to be on when people are, you know, when the switches of SCARF are being flipped and there's change and people's relationship to the organization, each other are changing. We finished that sort of literally as the dust was settling. We're like, we need to document what just happened here, and often come back to this as like people's reaction to the change is more what we are typically dealing with than the actual change that's happening. And I think we all have seen this in organizations that some overnight went to be entirely virtual. And people lost those reactions or those relationships, and as well as we're living in the midst of a global pandemic and other concerns that are now part of the workplace that maybe weren't before. So, but this is like one of the best chats in a meeting I've ever been in. I mean, this is like kudos to every one of you. This is like, I mean, I could just like watch the chat for this. So you brought it tonight for this. That's great.
Also, here's your reminder that you can also save the chat. You know, if you want to go back and read it later, if you want to get all of the links there. And speaking of links really quickly, we in the last item in our mural, which now I just somehow lost. Here we go. It was hiding behind SCARF because that's what happens. There is a section that has learn more. There we have links to our Work Shouldn't Suck side of the website where you can read a bunch of things, blog posts that we've written. You can also listen to our podcast. And then I also included some articles that we've recently been featured in. Yeah, this was our first time doing this virtually. We've had this section, this gameplay in various forms in person for a few times. So yeah, I guess we also were curious kind of what resonated. Did it make sense? What would you want more of? Any of those? And then also, how much would you be willing to pay for this outside Nova Scribes? And if you don't like want to actually tell that to our like face or something, you can also chat it to us individually if you're like, oh, I don't want to like have that be public. But any of those we would be much appreciative of for.
When you say pay for, is it For the session, or
The session, the like gameplay with the, basically this, the thing that what happened before right now. I mean, of course, you wouldn't be paying for the conversation about how much would you pay for it. I mean, that'd be quite funny. But, you know, we all know that you were willing to pay as much as you did to come to this session. But if it were not billed as like this is a test of it, and it was, or maybe if you're thinking about any of the organizations that you work with and you're like, I want them to take this, how much do you think they would be willing to pay for that session? Because we've done it at like we were going to bring it to multiple in-person conferences over the summer, but all of those got canceled. We did bring it to one in person in February, and then I hosted one that was a little bit more informal last fall. And so we've been kind of testing it out in different ways, but we want to have it be kind of similar to this so that anyone can join and think about it from their organization and have it be a similar time where it's like an hour and a half to 2 hours.
So Nicola, that brings up a whole lot of questions for me, because I'm always thinking of packages. Like, would people all be from the same place, and would they come together? Would they be from different places and have access to the cards ahead of time so they could do the work ahead of time? What kind of follow-up would there be? What kind of written instructions are they? Because some of this stuff is complex, you know, and some people, once again, don't know how to use Mural at all. And so that becomes a whole other factor. So for me, I'd be thinking in terms of, if I were doing this, what's the tier of packages that are offered for people? And that would be the way that I would start to think about it.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful.
Also, the chat suggestions, really, thank you so much for that as well.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I would think, Ryan said in the chat that he thinks this might be a good half-day session. I might even suggest two-hour blocks on different days where you give them an opportunity. You go through the model, you go through the cards, you know, give them a takeaway, a PDF of the cards, and let them take it and answer the questions anonymously and give you send the feedback to you, and then you compile. Because then you'll have that before picture, you know, or the after, whichever, but you'll have a point in time assessment of what they all think. And you don't have to, then it's anonymous, you know, particularly if it's a group bigger than 3, but even if it were 3, you could say, you know, the range of answers from in question, you know, on the first card is 1 to 4. The range of answers in the second card ranged from 2 to 4. You know, what do you think caused the range? What do you think causes the difference in people's perspectives? What are some examples that you might have seen for, you know, for why it might have gotten rated a 2, and then what are some other examples of a 4, and what caused the differences between the two? So it'd be interesting to do that part and really dive into some of the results in the second part. That gives you time. It gives you guys time to really look at the answers, and you might even then segregate them based on you know, the types of people in the organization. Did the ranges differ between departments, or supervisors versus non-supervisors, new people versus people who've been there a long time?
Right, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that the two-hour sections totally make a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
Brian, do you need to do the outro, and then we stop the video and then we wrap up?
I think we can. So let's give Nicola and Tim a Nova Scribes thank you. Snaps, jazz hands, yay. Thank you so much. We'll go ahead and record the video and get it out there as soon as possible. I will thank you so much. You guys were awesome. I'm going to go ahead and stop the video now. Thanks.